7:02 mornings.
Over the weekend, the Australian Republic movement celebrated its 25th anniversary, and according to new figures released by the group, the push for a Republic now has majority support in both houses of the federal parliament. Now, this comes in stark contrast to a news poll taken earlier this year, which showed that young people are surprisingly the least supportive of a push for Australia to dump the Queen. With only 46% of 18 to 34-year-olds wanting a republic, the figures could surprise a lot of people, considering that young generally hold a more progressive view when it comes to politics. So, why are the future people in favour of the status quo, and what does it mean for the future of the Republican movement? We're joined now by Joe Martinkovitz, the Executive Director of Australia's for a Constitutional Monarchy, and Jacob Rodrigo, a young spokesperson for the Australian Republican movement. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Simon. Jacob, good morning.
Jai, let's go to you first. As a young Australian, why do you support a constitutional monarchy?
Well, the primary attraction for me is really constitutional more than the monarchy itself. The monarchy is part and parcel of that system, and I think they do a fantastic job. But really it's a case of, if we were to have a change, how would that change be better for the rank and file people of Australia rather than just the political class? And nobody's been able to answer that question to my satisfaction.
Jacob, here's your chance to try and answer it.
Well, I don't know about to meet Jai's satisfaction, but I certainly think there's a strong case. At the end of the day, the reason I think the Republic is so important is because it's really the final step in becoming a truly independent nation. And I think that there are massive benefits for, as Jai calls them, the rank and file, the everyday person. And for me, the main one that comes up is a sort of deeper national culture. Right now, I think there's a bit of cultural cringe because we truly haven't become fully independent from the British. And I think this is the way to do that, so that we can have a really sort of richer, more meaningful Australian culture. And the Republic is the way to do that.
Jacob, with your role within the Australian Republic movement, are you surprised that the recent polls show that the young people are the least supportive of a Republic movement?
Yes and no. I was surprised when I first heard about it, but that was probably about a year ago, and I actually was doing a minor thesis at the time and focused my thesis on that specific sort of issue. And I found that there were a couple of reasons why young people weren't particularly supportive, and once you understand those, it is pretty understandable, and there is a clear path to resolving that. So
what were those key issues that you discovered in doing that thesis?
Sure. So there were the two main ones. The first one was simple awareness. The young people who are between 18 and 25 now, most of them weren't really alive or particularly interested in politics when the referendum happened. And since then, there's been definitely a drop in discussion about the Republic. So the first one is just they simply don't know of the issue itself. And the second one is those who do know, there are a lot of issues for them that take up sort of their political capital. There's housing affordability, there's the scarcity of jobs, those sorts of things. So once those two issues are forefront, and once the Republican movement has a strong education campaign, my research and the research of my supervisor shows that support will definitely rise.
It's interesting that we both come to the same conclusion, that it is about education, because we just have that same objective but think we'll arrive at different conclusions. The monarchist or constitutional monarchist camp is very much of the same opinion, that we need to educate people about our current system, and we think that people will then want to retain that existing system. But it's interesting that your research did come to the same conclusions, that it is a second-order issue. Young Australians and Australians more broadly just aren't interested at the moment in having that discussion. There's far more important things on the horizon.
Just put a small qualification in there. I didn't quite say it was a second-order issue. I definitely said that there's a lack of awareness, and once people do know it, it becomes a key issue for them.
If they can hone in on that awareness issue, it seems as though it's now being put very much on the front foot. Here is Malcolm Turnbull at the Australian Republic Movement 25th anniversary over the weekend. He had this to say.
Now, the vast majority of Australians have known no other head of state than the Queen. She was so admired and respected that few of us can say, whether monarchists or republicans, that we are not Elizabethans. I do not believe Australians would welcome, let alone support, another republic referendum during her reign. And as you know, I've held this view for some time. So why should we be a republic? What is the pitch? It is, as I said at the outset, a straightforward issue of principle and national pride. I am an Australian. I am proud to say so. Our head of state should be someone who can say the same. Our head of state should be one of us. Our president should be a resident.
That's Malcolm Turnbull at the address over the weekend. So, Jai, why don't you think our head of state needs to be a resident?
Well, what I thought was particularly interesting, in just talking about that speech just for a moment there, was the contradiction that Malcolm Turnbull made, where he said, and as has been the Republicans' argument since and including the 1999 referendum campaign, that we have to have an Australian as our head of state. Now, without getting into the detail of that argument, because we believe that we already have an Australian head of state in the Governor-General, Malcolm Turnbull came to that same conclusion not 6 months ago when he referred to the Governor-General as our head of state. So I can't understand this. It seems to be a matter of convenience, that when it's convenient to call our head of state the Governor-General, the Prime Minister is prepared to do that. But speaking to a sympathetic audience at the Australian Republican movement, he's making calls for the contrary.
Jacob.
Yeah, so I'm, in addition to having done that thesis last year, I'm now a law student. So I think I've got some small qualification to speak on that point. There is a clear difference between who Australia's head of state is de facto and de jure. So right now, sure, the Governor-General does act in some ways as the de facto head of state, but the head of state in law, the de jure head of state, clearly is the Queen of England in her capacity as the Queen of Australia. So I understand why it's a convenient argument for those who oppose the Republic to raise, because it does sort of seem to take away the wind in the sails, but it simply isn't factually true. So Jacob, I understand why Jai would raise it.
Jai, coming quickly.
Referred to in the Constitution, or is this something which is a matter of international law?
So I don't quite know what you're getting at there, but I would just simply say it's a matter of convention, and most of the key constitutional scholars out there, George Winterton as an example, have come to that conclusion.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But I have to say to both of you, Jay and Jacob, that at a time where discussion can sometimes get heated and people don't disagree politely, you guys have carried on very well. So thank you to both of you.
We're all Australians. I think we all want the best for this country. It's not a question of not wanting that. And I think that both sides of the argument have a place to put their views. Absolutely.
Couldn't agree more.
Hey, look, thank you very much for joining us. And on ABC Summer Mornings, that was our two spokespeople we had. First of all, Jai Martinkovitz, the Executive Director of Australians for a Constitutional Monarchy, but also Jacob Rodrigo, a spokesperson for the Australian Republican Movement.
Weekdays from 8:30 on 7:02 ABC Sydney.